even given its proper opinion. And now we have to like it or lump it. The small groups have been sidelined, and Mr. Alvaro apparently knows nothing about it. Mrs. Clamp says, yes, of course, we couldn't achieve exactly what we wanted, but Mr. Alvaro has a telephone, and it would have been perhaps easy enough to give us more information. So this is a deal struck in the corridors of power, and my group is going to vote en masse against it.
Merci, Madame Buitenweg. Madame
Thank you, Mrs. Buitenweg. Mrs. Kaufmann, 3 minutes on behalf of the GUE.
President, what I've heard last week on data retention is monstrous. This Parliament, since we had the Commission proposal, has been under considerable time pressure. From the very beginning, we understood that it had to be hammered out by the end of the year, come what may. So we couldn't have a proper consideration of the matter. And evidently, that wasn't the point either. Tomorrow, we won't be voting on the proposal of the Internal Affairs Committee, the Civil Liberties Committee, but we'll just be nodding through the Council proposal. As shadow rapporteur in my group, it's unacceptable that the two big groups ignored the vote of the committee and linked up with the Council. The compromise by the Socialists and the EPP with the Council stinks to high heaven. Colleagues, my group rejects the compromise proposal, so I said in committee, I said to together with Mrs. Buitenweg, submitted a minority vote and move that we should reject the Commission proposal tomorrow. I'll tell you why. The obligation to retain data puts ordinary citizens under suspicion. The Commission proposal means that 460 million citizens of the EU will be under a general suspicion. The planned data retention is a full frontal attack on the basic rights of European citizens. The protection of the private sphere and private conversations will be infringed. Press freedom, in particular the protection of sources and informants, will be put at stake. I doubt, and I'm looking at my German colleagues, that this is legal under the German constitution. There has been no proof that severe crimes can be combated by storing a lot of data. Of course, the prosecuting authorities must have the tools to be able to combat terrorism and serious crime, but that doesn't entitle severe infringements of personal rights and the exchange of data. So, should our Europe become a supervisory authority of ordinary citizens? I don't want that. As a member from Eastern Germany, I don't want to see that. A general suspicion on citizens linked with a collection of data which is available to the police and secret services. That type of political thinking was rejected by people in my part of the world, and that was the right thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Karatsaferis. You have a minute on behalf of Independence Democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, President, I think there's a difference between us and those on the other side of this House. Those on the other side of this House have worked to defend the interests of their governments, but we should be defending democracy. What are they asking of us? They are asking us to sell out the right to freedom of our peoples, to bind the hands of our citizens. They've asked that of us. What are we going to do? Well, just imagine the technology we might have in 2040. What if Hitler had had that technology? He would have killed even more Jews than he already did. What about Stalin's regime if they had these measures in place? And that's what we're being asked to agree to today. We're being asked to do this to the European people today. We are pillars of democracy. People are going to phone us up and say, what's going on? Surely criminals will buy prepaid phone cards or go to internet cafes. Are we really going to catch them with this kind of provision in place? I don't think so. I think all we're doing is harming the European people. Think with your heads. Don't just follow instructions from your party or group. Think and seek democracy. Thank you. Everything you've said today, I should remind you, is being carved in stone for time immemorial in the form of the tapes. Mr. La Russa for the UEN, you have 2 minutes 30 seconds. Thank you very much, President. Well, I think it's praiseworthy the efforts that Parliament and Council have made to achieve a first reading agreement so that we can swiftly adopt an urgent provision to fight terrorism and crime. I have always asserted that in the face of ongoing threats to peace and stability worldwide, citizens finding themselves in difficult circumstances would be prepared to accept a limitation on their own private lives. That the other side of the coin would be greater serenity and security. I think it's legitimate that we temporarily place a restriction on privacy if society as a whole can benefit from this. I do think that the compromises achieved are satisfactory, despite the obstructionist attitude so typical of segments of the left, and they simply speak calling on citizens' freedoms, but fail to do anything concrete, and therefore they show that they're more interested in easy propaganda and demagoguery. I think when it comes to fighting terrorism, we need specific and restrictive measures which comply with the principle of proportionality. I do think that the outcome of these negotiations will be a very worthy text that might still need some amendments. It's one that ministers from the EU have already reached an agreement on. This text is one that will be marrying rigorousness with a protection of freedom, allowing for longer data retention periods, but at one and the same time laying down arrangements to govern certain typical issues to do with privacy. There would be sanctions against those who make unlawful use of the data, for example. It's a text that would allow member states still to work to retain data on unanswered calls and would put in place some technical arrangements to reduce the cost. Italy might be a case in point here. It's one of the few member states already to have adopted specific legislation on the retention of data. The Italian rules are showing that they are effective now, and therefore I think we can agree to a 2-year data retention period if particular circumstances demanded that. I would hope that Italy would always be open to working together with you, and that therefore, President, when it comes to harmonising national legislation, its own legislation could be preserved, since it has stood the test of proving its efficiency, and in fact the Commission has already talked about the possibility of a derogation notification there. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mrs. Belahorska, you have 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, the report of Rapporteur Alvaro is extremely important, particularly nowadays when the citizens of Europe are under continuous threat of terrorist attacks. Actually, the most recent attacks in London and Madrid gave rise to anxiety among citizens because they hit civil structures and ordinary people going to work, to school, or to the hospital. On the one hand, the citizen is under a terrorist threat, who this way fight against the governments. On the other hand, the governments, in their fight against terrorism, use the citizens, intervene their privacy, infringe their rights. So we should firmly oppose monitoring as citizens. I'm speaking of the type of monitoring as in Big Brother.